Naughty Dog's award-winning hit The Last of Us has officially been adapted for the screen by the folks over at HBO. And I have so much to say about it. Specifically, I have a lot to say about the show's prologue, which is actually about twice the length of the original one from the game. So, why is it so long? What exactly did they change? And why does it work so well? Heads up, there are spoilers ahead for both versions of The Last of Us prologue. If you haven't seen either of those, I would go pick one, watch it, and then come back here. Also subscribe to me while you're at it, because that would be cool. Now, in both versions of the story, we are first introduced to the Last of Us core narrative from the perspective of Sarah Miller, teenage daughter of our central character, Joel Miller. Sarah becomes our eyes and ears as the world falls apart and fungal zombies ravage the human population. But the question here is why, which I think is a good question to ask about any narrative decision. To the best of my knowledge, both versions of the story use Sarah Miller to orient the audience to the narrative's reality, as we begin the prologue in a recognizable version of Earth that quickly transitions into an apocalyptic hellscape. Sarah Miller becomes a cultural reference point to the audience, as she is very much a little girl in the 2000s, from the Beyoncé posters on her wall to the shark tooth necklace around her neck. Her perspective provides a clear and recognizable entry point to a narrative that goes quickly off the rails in terms of historical accuracy. However, there is still a major change regarding Sarah's perspective, namely the point at which it starts. In the televised version of The Last of Us, the prologue spans from the moment Sarah wakes up on September 26th to the zombie apocalypse a mere 24 hours later. The game, however, starts with a conversation between Joel and Sarah at like 10 p.m. I think this change was exceedingly necessary in order to get the audience invested in Sarah's world, a process that works very differently between the two mediums. Video games rely on player interaction to function, which is actually the foundation of an academic term called meaningful play that I will not get into because who cares? Basically, when the player is playing as Sarah throughout the majority of the prologue, that is physically taking actions as that character and then seeing their outcome, it brings an immediate sense of personal investment to the story. There's an automatic connection between the player and character because, in a sense, they are that character. But in television, we aren't moving the actors around by pressing triangle to open a door. They are doing that all on their own, and we, the audience, take a much more passive role. But the writers still need to prove to us that we should care about this little girl, and they do so through what I am going to call experiential exposition, basically showing us who a character is, what their relationships are, and what they want through action rather than text. For example, in the game, players can wander around Sarah's room until they find a forgotten birthday card to her dad. This text acts as a meaningful reward for player exploration, giving an emotional tidbit about Sarah and Joel's relationship through the card's inscription. But in the show, this type of text would feel very, very unnatural. So, instead of that mess, we get to see our little family of two just exist together, with playful jabbing about each other's cooking skills, an immense amount of sarcasm, and a little affection thrown in for good measure. We don't need to be told what their relationship is because we see it play out, which in a video game would feel long, awkward, and unneeded, since players generally want to take action, and the game's narrative relies on that player action to function. It is actually by a very similar principle that the show manages to keep the rising tension and creeping horror of the game alive. By that I mean that both versions deprive their audience in a way that works with the medium. I feel like that didn't make much sense. Let me explain. In the game, when acting as Sarah Miller, the player's movement is consistently restricted. She can only walk when we're in the house, she can only turn her head when we're in the truck, and there are only like 2 object interactions the entire time. Now, each of these restrictions feels natural to the moment, but mechanically, they require the game to be played at a slower pace, with expositional news clips, overheard radio chatter, and visual explosions filling the dead air and providing us our narrative setup. In the filmed version, narrative setup is provided by this clip of a 1960s talk show, where a scientist explains the possibility of worldwide extinction by fungus if global warming continues. Now, in addition to being absolutely terrifying, this sequence also places the idea of such a pandemic into the minds of its audience right before shoving them into the almost unnervingly normal daily routine of Sarah Miller. And while that thought's just nestling back there, they then deprive the audience of any sound design beyond natural folly. So that is quiet, with light sirens, tense chatter, and the occasional cough. That, plus an increase in shot length and decrease in camera movement as the day goes on, builds a tension so thick that I could not breathe the first time I watched it. Speaking of which, let's get into that zombie apocalypse and a scene that has kept me crying since 2013. So Sarah dies, by the way, and it is gut-wrenching. And I've thought a lot about this, so I'm going to give you 2 reasons why I think that is. Firstly, there is a major perspective shift in the last few minutes of the prologue that makes you think both Joel and Sarah made it out alive, and it happens right after the car crash. In the game, this crash marks the spot where you officially take control of Joel as a player, and in the television show, there is a blackout after the car crash that is broken by Joel coming to consciousness before rescuing his daughter from the burning car. So, when the gunman eventually shoots, our investment follows Joel, who, again in both versions, makes sure to show the camera that he was only grazed. When I watched this pilot with a friend of mine who knows absolutely nothing about the story, she actually let out an audible sigh of relief when she saw Joel was unharmed. It seemed impossible to her that anything bad could have happened outside of her window of perspective, which is why it is so messed up that both versions of Tommy are the ones who notice Sarah first, and the camera or cutscene doesn't move until Joel notices, and your heart just breaks. A second reason why I think this scene works so well has to do with Joel's final words to his kid. In the game, Troll Baker's Joel begs Sarah not to leave him with a heartbreaking, "Don't do this to me, baby girl." And in the show, Pedro Pascal's Joel gives a soft little please before just holding her silently. Both of these are able to convey Joel's desperation and dependence on his daughter, but they do so for different reasons. In the game, it's this moment of dialogue that emphasizes Joel's need for Sarah. He's putting into words what he could never quite say and is literally begging her to live. In the show, it goes back to experiential exposition. Sarah has been taking care of Joel all episode. She acts as his alarm, she makes him breakfast, and she gets his watch fixed for his birthday because, quote, she knew he would never do it for himself. With this piece of their relationship established throughout the episode, all we need is a please, and I am once again in tears. So, why exactly is The Last of Us pilot so long? Because it needed to be. Adapting a story across mediums should never be a carbon copy from one to the other, no matter how many beautifully recreated shots make the final cut. Instead, writers should be translating the thematic core of their inspiration into an entirely different creative language. They should work to the advantages of their new medium, which is exactly what I think The Last of Us is doing so well. And you know what? Good on them. That's all. Bye!